Not a matter of if, but when crisis will rock your world. I'm Rashini Rajkumar, crisis strategist, licensed attorney, and host of The Crisis Files. In each case file, we cover crises and controversies, always looking for solutions in prevention. My guest today is use of force expert and former police officer Joe Dutton. Law enforcement narratives of the past few years hit the profession and the public in multifaceted ways. As some communities looked for more transparency, departments across the United States lost officers or had to flex entry requirements. Joe is here to dive into the case file I call One Nation Under Law. Joe, I imagine all of this affects public safety.
Yes, it does. You stated that over the last 4 years especially, there's been a lot of pressure on law enforcement, maybe even the last 7 years. The defund the police movement came, and that really affected law enforcement nationwide. Officers left the profession. They haven't returned. Agencies are having a tough time recruiting new officers because people don't want to get involved with the police right now because of a couple of factors. One is, back in the day, if an officer did something that was out of policy, let's say, they would be retrained or maybe receive some sort of internal discipline. But nowadays, they're criminally prosecuting them. And that has a huge, huge effect on police officers because they're trying to do their job. It's a difficult job. There's always going to be force being used at least some points in their careers. And if you're going to be scrutinized for, using the force that was necessary for you to restrain somebody or take them into custody, then that plays on their minds. It hurts morale. Officers don't want to be engaged in something like that because they're not expecting that. But you find yourself being criminally charged and indicted for things that you were trying to do in order to rectify a situation.
Right, and that really goes when I think of being a child and my first images of law enforcement, someone pulling you over for speeding, perhaps. You just, you saw the police and you hoped you hadn't done something wrong, maybe it was a mistake, or you knew you were speeding and you were going to get a ticket. But never in my mind did I think that would lead to any of those kinds of pullovers, would lead to those officers being charged of a crime. And that's just kind of the place where we are right now. You mentioned training, Joe, and I looked into this and some interesting information from the Institute for Criminal Justice Training Reform. There are no federally mandated requirements in the United States when it comes to training. In fact, 37 U.S. states allow untrained officers to detain, arrest, and kill. And when I say untrained, they can be out on the job as their training is about to get started. So they can actually do the job, the work of the job in 37 states before they're fully done with training. There's also a range of requirements across the states for training. In Connecticut, you need a minimum of 9 months in basic training. In Hawaii, there is no basic training requirement. So this is like this cornucopia of rules around the United States of America, and then no federal mandate for across the federal system imposing on the states. I mean, it almost seems incredibly unfair when you have that kind of patchwork going on, that an officer could be charged with a crime for doing a job when they weren't even in a unified system of training.
Yeah, that's right. Training is complicated and expensive. When I talk about officers need more training, it really has to do with repetitive training. Most of the officers get training in, let's say, firearms or use of force, hand-to-hand, unarmed tactics, things of that nature. But if you only do it once a year, they don't retain it. So you have to have more repetitive training. You have to have more than 1 or 2 firearm trainings a year. You got to keep up with that. And some agencies can do it because they have their own firing range. My agency had our own firing range, so we could use our firearms in practice as much as we wanted for the most part. But a lot of agencies don't have that opportunity. And like in reference to unarmed tactics, I trained officers how to use unarmed tactics like joint manipulations or how to take people down and things of that nature. But if we only did it once a year, if we did it the next year, you could see where they didn't remember all of the technique because there's some really small nuances in techniques so they would work. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. So, Joe, for over 31 years of your career in law enforcement, you worked in the cities of Mound and Golden Valley, Minnesota. You also were in Metro Transit Police. So really giving people the idea of you saw a lot of things. What were some of, I guess, the craziest things you saw that were literally in your face that, but for you, the rest of us would have been in harm's way?
Well, there's been several situations where people were armed and were either threatening to kill themselves or others. I can remember one case, this guy had a large butcher knife and chased the two people that were in this apartment out of the room, and I ended up being the first officer on scene, and I ended up having to negotiate with them. And so I had a training in negotiations. I was a SWAT officer. But I ended up negotiating with that individual for a very long time as he held a knife and was probably 10 feet from me, and I had my gun on him and telling him, if you come any further, I'm going to use deadly force. And he was on some drugs at that time, so he wasn't really kind of with himself.
You could discern that from what you saw.
Yeah, just because of the behavior. It just appeared that he was on drugs and suffering mental illness to boot. So I am negotiating with him for a long time. I kept him at a distance where I didn't have to use my firearm, but I was fully capable of it, and I told him I would do it. So he was aware. In those types of cases, too, you're always concerned about a suicide by cop. He maybe was threatening himself or the other people in the apartment, but he also maybe couldn't do it himself, so he was going to force me to, make the play for him and use deadly force. And that's not uncommon in law enforcement. Everybody thinks it's like a once-in-a-blue moon deal, but it's not.
That's almost a weekly occurrence in some departments.
Probably so. I mean, across the nation, they're probably dealing with that a lot, but it can happen to anybody, any law enforcement officer.
That butcher knife situation, was that farther along in your career or early in your law enforcement career?
That was further along in my career.
So you also had the training, the years of experience, the visual, the maturity to handle that situation.
That's right. That's a great point. That maybe an officer was 6 months on getting that same kind of situation would have a lot more difficulty dealing with it. But I had the training. I had done several other types of negotiations like that. So I was kind of aware of where I wanted to be in that conversation with this individual and how I wanted to kind of steer the negotiation so I could make a point with this individual and get them to give it up. And ultimately, he did.
I love that you call it a negotiation. And let's be real. There are good cops and there are not so good cops. There are bad cops. There are evil cops, just like there are good people and bad people. But I still would like to think as an American citizen, most of, if not all, the majority, let's say the majority to maybe 90+% of law enforcement in the United States want to do good.
I agree with that 100%. I mean, if you look through the battery of tests, both psychological, physical, background checks that officers go through before they're even hired. So, I mean, it's pretty extensive. People don't understand. We take a battery of psychological tests. We meet with a psychiatrist. We have to go through physical conditioning and medical treatment. And the background checks take a long time because they go pretty far back into your life. See, there's standards in those psychological situations. The psychiatrists that read like a Minnesota multiphasic or a CPI, California, multiphasic, inside those psychological tests are traits that the psychologist or psychiatrist is looking at. And if you don't have those traits, I know many people that couldn't pass their psychologicals.
You would not be passed by the psychiatrist or psychologist.
Nope.
All right, let's get into some of the differences across the nation. So the New York Police Department was established in 1845, has 36,000 officers and 19,000 civilian employees. Let's compare that with Los Angeles, which is the third largest department in the U.S., established in 1853. 8,800 officers, only 3,000 civilian employees. And in their 2024 budget, they tried to end the year with 9,500, but they weren't able to do that because they were fighting for applicants. So even you've got New York, you've got LA, the first and third biggest departments in the United States, and such a difference in number of officers. Why do we see these kinds of differences?
Because when our country was established, it started on the East Coast. And the system of policing came over from England, Robert Peel. And that was a more walking the beat type of policing. Like officers would be in one neighborhood, because they could be in that neighborhood their whole careers. And they get to know everybody in that neighborhood. They get established in those neighborhoods, and they would handle the calls in that neighborhood. And as the country grew, as it went towards the West, we became more of a squad car type of law enforcement, where officers responded to calls all over the city in squad cars. See, in New York, you needed more manpower because you were putting 2 officers on every block, basically. So that's why that department grew so large. Plus, it's a very dense population.
Right. I mean, you can actually walk around in that city. Harder to do in Los Angeles or even Chicago.
Yeah, and in Los Angeles, it's not really walkable. It's more like a large suburban city is what it is. So officers needed to get around, so they put them in squad cars. And as it moves west, you see more of that type of policing in the west as opposed to the east. Like Boston is similar to New York. It's an East Coast city. That's the way they do business. It's just done differently, like you were saying earlier about training and all that. I mean, it's just different. And so across the country, it's different everywhere. People do things differently everywhere. Some get more training, some get less training, some have bigger areas to cover. So it's interesting.
I want to share, and part of the reason I wanted to do this case file, One Nation Under Law, is to help us grow our attitude, both with the police and for the police. I, again, always will go back to the majority of the police in my mind want us to be safe. They want honesty. They want to do their jobs well. But an interesting quote from Colin Kaepernick, activist athlete, a name that many of us know. He said, "You can become a cop in 6 months and don't have to have the same amount of training as a cosmetologist." So we looked up some numbers. How many hours of training do you have to have across different professions to get started in that profession? Lawyers, 4,700 hours. Nurses, 4,500 hours. Plumbers, 3,000. Cosmetologists, 3,000. Compared with 6 months of training, which there's no way you could have thousands of hours in 6 months, right? So that is really interesting. And even if we compare with other countries, Portugal, you need to have 10,500 hours of training to be a police officer. India, 5,500. England, 2,500. And they don't really carry guns even in England. And you have to have that training. So when we think about this conversation that continues in the United States about law enforcement, public safety, bad cops, good cops, all of this, which I wish we could just get through the noise. Where does the change happen? Does it have to happen at the legislature? Because I just don't know that we can, when there are no federally mandated requirements and each state kind of gets to do what it gets to do, it seems like there's a fundamental flaw in how we lay things out in the United States when it comes to officer training.
I agree. It is mandated by states. Like we have a post board in the state of Minnesota, and they dictate certain trainings an officer has to have within, I believe it's a 3-year period. But that isn't the only training you need. That's what they're saying you need to have minimally. Most officers, I'll use Minnesota as an example, you have to have a minimum 2-year degree to even become a police officer. Most officers have 4-year degrees in criminal justice. So that's training that's not being counted as being put on the agency that an officer is going to work for. So if you compare that with the numbers, 2 years is a lot of hours. Or if you got a 4-year, that's a lot of hours. So if you tack that on to the number of hours we're talking there, Minnesota has the most probably educated police department in the country.
Right. And so as we've kind of learned, each state is different. And I think that in itself is the core issue. And what is training time in higher education, a 2-year or 4-year degree, plus what you do in the field. Is it only in the field? I mean, because we hear about police officers sometimes in their early 20s or even 20 years old becoming a police officer. So the inconsistency is what I think is leading to some of the issues. What would you like for people listening today who are regular members of the public, which is most of us? What would you like them to know as they move forward in their own relationships with public safety and law enforcement?
I would say that I would like them to know that you were correct with your statement earlier that police officers are out there to help people. They're not out there to hurt people. Now, like I said earlier, too, use of force does happen sometimes. We have to deal with people that are out of control or causing disturbances and not complying to our verbal orders. I'll say this. Every use of force that an officer uses is because of non-compliance. Officers are going to give you orders to do things, and if you don't do them, it can escalate to possible force. But if you do what the officer tells you to do and don't escalate it, he's never going to use any force on you, or she is not going to use any force on you. So if you comply, you don't have force used on you. If you don't comply, you're going to have some force used on you. And that's just the way it goes. Most people do exactly what police officers say. I mean, there's 20 million traffic stops across this country. 20 million. How much do you see go bad there? So
every year.
Every year. So those contacts, those are police officers making contacts with the citizens, like you said earlier.
Every day, every hour.
Every day, every hour. 20 million. So if you put that in perspective to how many bad things people see cops do, or I would say this, people don't like to see officers use force on people, but that does not mean it's not what the officer's trying to do.
And it doesn't mean it's happening every time.
Oh, of course not. I had to use force over my career, but it wasn't a daily event. It wasn't like, we're going to have force today. Those things just come up. Incidents just come up. And basically, like I said earlier, it has to do with non-compliance. If I tell you to do something, and it's a lawful order, I should say, and you don't do it, and then I give you another order, they're going to give you several orders in order to get you to do what they want you to do without having to use force. But the officer's assessing you the whole time. He's asking you to do these things. That's part of the assessment. He or she is making an assessment by giving you orders and seeing if you're going to comply or not. We call it yes, no, maybe. Yes, you're going to comply. No, you're not going to comply. Or maybe I can get you to comply. So, that's the yes, no, maybe part of police officer training. But we have to assess where I'm at with that. That's what I'm saying. Do I have a maybe person? That's part of the assessment. Do I have a no person? That's part of the assessment. Or I have a yes person. That's part of the assessment.
I'm guessing there are a lot of parents out there that can relate to the yes, no, maybe continuum.
I'll bet.
It really applies
right.
to life, right?
Yes.
Joe, I don't want to end without asking about the mental health aspects, which are completely part of what's happening in the United States and in other parts of the world, too. What kind of grade would you give the country and the law enforcement for really understanding how mental health plays into all of these officer-civilian interactions?
I started being a police officer in 1977. And to be honest, I didn't come across people suffering from mental illness very often. Towards the end of my career, I was dealing with 1 or 2 or 3 a day. So we see that the mental illness factor is really having a big effect on police contacts with people. And officers know how to handle it. It's a matter of what that other individual that's suffering the mental illness is doing. They have to react to that. We're always reacting to other people's actions. Plus, making that assessment, trying to de-escalate the situation. And that's what I want to mention. A lot of people talk today about officers not getting de-escalation training. Sure we do. Sure we have. When I started in 1977, I knew how to de-escalate things.
It seems like that's everything that you do is about de-escalation.
Exactly right. So it's like when they say, they didn't get de-escalation training or this and that. No, they do. It's just that sometimes de-escalation doesn't work because the person you're dealing with isn't cooperating. So, you're trying to de-escalate every time, most times. But, they go to domestics. Those are heated. So we have to calm things down there and de-escalate what's going to happen next. So that happens pretty often. we're good at it. We know what we're doing, but the other people that we're dealing with don't always cooperate.
Joe, thank you so much for going into this issue with us. It's not an easy one. It's so multidimensional, but I have hope that we're going to grow the understanding for law enforcement, for what they do, and what we as a public are also expected to do to be part of a healthier equation.
Yeah, we have to get along.
Yeah, exactly. Today's case file is powered by Huntington. Huntington, home of early pay. You could get paid up to 2 days faster, and there's no cost. It's your money, so stop playing the waiting game. Find out more at huntington.com/yourmoney. Direct deposit and eligibility requirements apply. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at The Crisis Files. Rate, review, and subscribe to The Crisis Files on your platform of choice. Check out our website, thecrisisfiles.com, for all case files, and to drop me a line about topics you want us to cover in the future. I'm Roshini Rajkumar. Join me next time on The Crisis Files.